Supposedly it's recording now, so as with everything, I will wait to be surprised by the result. And let me get this PowerPoint up and we will begin. A week from today, we are going to read the Bhagavad Gita. There's a large picture of me. It says it's still recording. I don't entirely believe it, but we'll see how it goes. All right. A week from today, we're going to read the Bhagavad Gita. I am going to email you all which teachings, that is, basically, which chapters you should be reading. And let me just make sure that this is still... It says so let's, as I said, let's wait to be surprised. Okay, when we talk about the Bhagavad Gita next week, we're going to be talking about a part of a larger text, but something that is fairly central to an understanding of Hinduism. And I want to spend some time today talking about Hinduism because of the various faiths we will see in South Asia, Hinduism is the one practiced or followed by the most people. It's also, I think, perhaps the least familiar to you. In Western Civ courses, perhaps you've talked a little about Islam, you've certainly perhaps talked about Christianity and Judaism. Maybe you talked about Zoroastrianism as well, we can get to that. But I think we ought to have a little talk about Hinduism, especially because even today in South Asia, there is an effort to argue that Hinduism is linked to nationalism. And one of the things I think that an early exploration of Hinduism can let us understand is the really complicated and diverse nature of Hinduism. That is, what's called Hinduism is in some ways an umbrella term encompassing an enormous number of beliefs, practices that range from sort of mass festivals, institutional sort of practices, to very personal level devotions. So when we're going to talk about Hinduism today. We're going to talk about Hinduism's impact on the evolution of a couple of other practices in India, most particularly Buddhism and Jainism. And then, and I want you to think a little bit about the way in which, just as there is sort of diversity linguistically, ethnically, regionally within India, even within religions, even within Indian religious practices or within South Asian religious practices, there is a diversity. Not just Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, but within all of these practices as well. So we're going to talk a bit about Hinduism today, just to give you an idea as to or to give you a greater sort of grounding in some of the things that you may not be most familiar with. What I'm going for here today is less an explanation of Hinduism as theology. That is, that's an entire course. That's an entire lifetime of work. There are people who are professors of Hinduism, professors of Sanskritic philosophy and theology. We are not going to attempt to cover all of that today. What I want to talk more about is Hinduism's sort of constitutive parts, the things that go into Hinduism, a brief understanding of Hinduism's worldview, but also, in particular, the way in which these religious practices shape social and cultural practices more generally in South Asia. This sort of social and cultural impact or influence that Hinduism has had. Hinduism is linked to or is seen as originating in the religious and cultural practices of the people who begin to filter into South Asia around the period 2000 to 1500 BCE. The people who will sometimes be called the Aryans, sometimes be called Indo-Europeans. As we'll talk about next time, there is actually a civilization or a sort of spread out series of small settlements, even you might say small city-states, prior to this migration, but they disappear. These are the so-called Indus Valley civilizations. We'll talk about them next time in a little more detail. But they disappear by about 2000 or so BCE. leaving behind an impressive record of construction, of metalwork, of coinage, of evidence of some religious practice, and of a language that to this day no one has ever been able to decipher. That is, they have a written language, but no one's ever been able to read it. The first person who does that will, let me see, be very famous. And people have always said, yes. You hit it?
This is the Aryan/Indo-European people?
No, I'm talking about the people we're going to talk about next time who precede the Indo-Aryans. I just want to mention them briefly here. This is the so-called Indus Valley civilizations. We'll talk about two places called Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro next time. I don't want to confuse people. You're right. Let's leave them to the side, them and their impenetrable language to the side, and think about these people who start to move in around the period 2000 to 1500 BCE. Again, this is a culture whose religious texts and religious practices are in many ways a key to their larger society. That is, there are fewer sort of archaeological remnants, fewer sort of literary, fewer non-literary artifacts that people can use to reconstruct life in South Asia in about 1500 BCE. So instead, these are enormously important, not only because what they the influence they have in the development of what we call Hinduism, but also because what they tell us about this particular society at this particular time. Here's what we know. Out of this Indo-European or Aryan culture come a series of texts which are ultimately put together and really sort of amalgamated by about 1000 BCE. These are known as the Vedas, V-E-D-A-S. By the way, I put the PowerPoint presentation from last time. I couldn't get the video thing working, but I put the PowerPoint presentation from last time up on the Blackboard site, and I'll do it again with this, so you'll have access to these terms and pictures and things like that. The Veda is a term, or the Vedas is sort of a category that contains sacred commentaries, books about ritual, books of hymns or mantras, things to be chanted, and also philosophies. Within, this may be a familiar term to some of you, I'm not sure. Sidney Mintz, Sweetness and Power, excellent book. Hardly urge you to read it. He just died. Influence of Sugar on History. Within these Vedas, something we will not read, but the most philosophical parts are known as the Upanishads. The most important within these is the Rig Veda. That is, the Rig Veda is a collection of just over 1,000 hymns and mantras. That is, things to be chanted, things to be used when observing rituals, when participating in devotions. For most archaeologists and historians studying this period, they look at the Rig Veda as an excellent source for life in northern South Asia around the year 1000 BCE. But that's not the only thing. There are also going to be some epic texts. Now, in Hinduism, I was talking about sort of a diversity, there is no one set text. There's no Bible, Quran, Torah. Instead, there are a multiplicity of texts, none of which is said to be sort of authoritative, none of which is said to be divinely authored, except in the sense that all creation is in some ways divinely inspired or owes its existence to some sort of divine, it's a divine power, or what might be also called sort of some sort of absolute power in the world. We'll get to that momentarily. These epics are very important because the epics are used, again, as vehicles for teaching. Not simply good stories, not simply epically long stories, but also things that are designed to sort of give people an idea about the place they live, the gods and goddesses who influence their lives, and the philosophies, the ideas that govern how they will live their lives. Between 1700 BCE, these two are formulated. Although one, the Mahabharata, I always struggle with that. The Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is seen as having a little more coherence, seen as having a little more sort of artistic and authorial coherence. The Ramayana is seen as being sort of perhaps a collection of more diffuse voices. But let me give you just a brief description. The Mahabharata is the longest single poem in the world. It is the story, in the first place, of a dispute between families, between cousins, between aristocratic lineages over land. The Mahabharata contains the Bhagavad Gita, selections of which we'll be reading and discussing next week. And just as a little preview, the Bhagavad Gita is sort of, one of the reasons I said it's sort of this mixture of influences in one and sort of more sort of, you can say sort of coherence in the other, is that the Bhagavad Gita occupies a sort of central spot in the Mahabharata. And it is the god Krishna. And we'll talk about sort of the forms that Krishna takes and the way in which Krishna is in fact the avatar or the appearance of another god, advises the prince, who's sort of the central character, a man named Arjuna. Krishna is disguised as his chariot driver. And the entire sort of premise behind the Bhagavad Gita is Arjuna's questions, his reluctance, his unease with the task he has to face, which is going to war against members of his own family. That is the larger sort of context in which the Bhagavad Gita comes out. And the Bhagavad Gita, well, it does ultimately move the story along, is a pause in which there is this sort of philosophical argument made, mostly by Krishna, about what Arjuna should do and how Arjuna ought to approach it. The Ramayana is a little more sort of an adventure story. It ultimately concerns the god Rama's quest to find his wife Sita. Again, Rama is, both Rama and Krishna are incarnations, or avatars, you might say, of the god Vishnu. And we'll get more into this. Again, this is, as I said, this is a very brief introduction to Hinduism. I'm not trying to cover everything. To understand Hinduism, one has to grasp a particular concept. So these are sort of the texts, and out of these texts, out of these writings, these hymns, these philosophical treatises, you can see a sort of a coherent worldview emerging. The fancy sort of theological term that will help us, I think, understand Hinduism a little bit is the term monism. Has anyone ever heard of monism before? No? Okay. Monism basically means this. All things in creation are elements of a single universal substance. All things in creation are elements of a single universal substance. In essence, everything emanates from one thing, with the philosophical implications and the theological implications that all creation is connected. Everything in this world, seen and unseen, is linked together. It is seamless in some senses. That's what we have to understand going forward about Hinduism. That's the thing that emerges from these texts. And is as close as you can come, perhaps, to saying, to sort of defining the foundations of this religious practice. Everything proceeds from one thing. Is everyone with me? So the fancy term, monism. And again, you can see sort of the basis there, mon as in monotheism, one, monism, one. Everything out of one. And I'm going to give you a brief sort of description of how this works in introducing you to some of the Hindu deities and to some particular religious practices and devotional ideas or devotional rituals that are used. Questions? Concerns? Yes?
It's interesting that they're monists, but not monotheists typically. Interesting that monotheists are not always monists.
It depends. Yeah, I mean there is. Well, the thing is that if you are how should I put this? If you are a monist is sort of a retreat to the ultimate first principle. So if monotheists exist in the world, they are in fact that goes along with monism. That is because everything in creation is simply based in this one thing, this one element, this one substance. So it's a way of ultimately saying there is no difference. But you're right, monotheists argue not only for the centrality of one God, but argue for only the existence of one God. Some people will argue that monism is in some ways like monotheism. I'm not going to go down that trail because we'll emerge sometime next February. And we will not be any the wiser, I think. We will all have headaches, though. But let me give you a little bit of idea. For monists, for Hindus, the one from whom all emerges, the one from whom all emanates, is Brahman. I want to say, what is Brahman? Brahman is. That is, everything in this world is an emanation from, a creation from, however you want to talk about it, Brahman. Each of us, in this particular worldview, every person, every piece of creation carries within it a tiny little piece of the divine, reflecting its origins. It's the, I didn't put this up here, but the notion of what's called Atman. And again, this is a very, very brief introduction, but the notion that there is this small piece of the divine in everyone. Some people equate this to your soul, to your spirit. It's sort of undefinable, as is perhaps even the idea of Brahman itself. But Brahman is the one without second. Brahman is. Everyone with me there? You can't pin down. Brahman, male or female, not a question. Brahman is. Now, there are certain, you might say, facets or manifestations of this particular divine spirit designed to tell people about it, designed to instruct people about it, designed to make this world work. That is, within Brahman, within existence, you do have divines. There are three a principle here, and then there's one other sort of what might be described as almost a sort of a less of a deity than a sort of power or spirit in the world. There's three. One is Brahma. Brahma is the god who brings everything into visible creation. And really, given that, it's perhaps no surprise that then Brahma sits. I mean, that's a lot to do. And then Brahma sits and meditates. Brahma is often depicted as, no, these didn't come out very well at all either, did they? But Brahma, I'll go one further here. Brahma is at times given the depiction of facing in all directions, at the center of creation. There are a couple of others. The second is Vishnu. I'll go back to this list here so you can see. Vishnu is the preserver. Vishnu is the one who instructs in doing what's right, or what more accurately is called right action. It's Vishnu appearing as Krishna, who is the major force in the Bhagavad Gita. And by right action, what Vishnu is talking about is Vishnu as Krishna. Is talking about is Dharma. One of the other reasons we start with this is that in the last sort of 20, 30 years, you had sort of a much greater embrace of not, I would say, Hinduism or Hindu practices, but sort of an idea of sort of quote-unquote Asian spirituality or quote-unquote Indian spirituality in other parts of the world. But oftentimes you have lots of terms that tend to be misused or used very loosely. Dharma means, in essence, right action. It is duty. That's what Krishna/Vishnu is going to be talking to Arjuna about in the Bhagavad Gita. What is your duty? What is your dharma? I'm not going to get into that too much here. But dharma, the meaning of dharma is not always set. That is, what is the right action is something that can be debated. Is it doing what you're supposed to do because of your birth, because of your position in society? Later on, the question will be, is it doing what you're supposed to do in a larger sort of ethical or moral sense? But Dharma is Vishnu. Vishnu is the preserver, the protector, shows you what's right. The other major sort of deity here is Shiva. Shiva is destruction. But not destruction necessarily in terms of sheer malevolence, but in the idea of a continued cycle of creation and recreation. That is, Shiva brings things down so that they may be recreated, may be built anew. Creative destruction, to use a sort of a kind of a cliche. But the idea is that, and Shiva, in addition to Shiva's sort of role as a destroyer, the idea is that, let me go ahead here a second. This is Vishnu, and this is showing some of the major avatars or appearances of Vishnu, things with which Vishnu is linked, extending all the way out here to the elephant-headed god Ganesh. But again, there is this idea that Vishnu appears as certain other, or in certain other guises, usually to instruct people on what they ought to do. Shiva is oftentimes depicted like this. Shiva dances. That is, when Shiva dances, the world turns. Things fall apart. Shiva is also, however, held out to be the ideal role model for husbands. He is the ideal consort, you might say. So there is this sort of a group of three, if we look at Brahma, Shiva, and Vishnu. But there's something else working as well. Something that is even sort of, you might say, harder to understand, but that's something that is embodied in a whole series of female divines. Shakti. Sometimes you'll see it spelled just K-T-I, sometimes you'll see it spelled K-H-T-I. Shakti is this notion of divine energy. And it's associated very particularly with women. And the notion is that it is this divine energy which gives life to things. It is this divine energy which is, which, no pun intended, flows through things like the Ganges River, the Ganga, which is held to be a sort of mother goddess. Because, of course, the river, as we talked about last time, simply geographically and environmentally, in South Asia, a river like the Ganges gives life. One of the things that's oftentimes sort of contrasted is that people will do certain devotions in the Ganges River, at the banks of the Ganges, at daybreak, at dawn, so that they can have what's seen as sort of be present in sort of or be witness to both the Ganges and to the sunrise. The Ganges, which is associated again with this feminine power, this feminine idea of divine energy, Shakti, and then the sun, which is associated with male power. So you have these again, and again, we're going to talk about. There are so many practices and multiple practices that it's you can't necessarily pin one down as sort of absolutely you might say sort of orthodox or fundamental. But these are some of the big figures. Yes.
Of the three,
Yeah.
there was like praise for Brahma sits. There was one for Shiva dances. Was there one for Vishnu?
Vishnu preserves. Yeah.
Was there one for Shakti?
Shakti is not, because Shakti is seen almost more as an energy that flows through female figures and that is harnessed by female figures, both for good and for bad. That is, it's not simply the idea that they will provide energy, they will provide life, but also some female figures, like, for example, Kali, K-A-L-I, who is a manifestation of one of Shiva's consorts. I'm not going to even begin to get into this, but who is seen as in some ways, the bringer of death. That is, people will say when things are bad, they say we're living in an age of Kali. So you have, again, this notion of a sort of an energy to which women, or at least female figures, have access that others like Shiva and Vishnu do not. Shiva and Vishnu they're never going to have incarnations as women. They're sort of definably male. Brahman, the sort of basis of all this, neither male nor female. As I said, Brahman is. And don't think that this is, one of the recent sort of estimations, and this is just an estimation, of where people see the divine, whether they identify a local spirit, whether they identify someone, a teacher, a guru, a saint, someone who has sort of gone on, someone who has passed on, someone who has perhaps gone and been released from this life into the next. There's some estimated somewhere around 250 to 300 million identifiable manifestations of, you might say, Brahman. That is, we're all, in some senses, manifestations of Brahman, but these are influential ones. These are ones who can affect your life. Whether it's local deities, people giving or ascribing powers to rivers, to other sort of natural phenomena, or local gods and goddesses, who people claim as their patrons, the people who watch over them, the people who need to be sort of favored and praised and remembered. So again, it's between sort of 250 and 300 million. The big thing within this practice, whether you are using, and there's no sort of exclusivity. If you're a Shaivite, that is, you have a devotion to Shiva, that doesn't mean that you can't also have devotions to Vishnu. You will see people who would declare their devotions one way or another, but it's not necessarily exclusive. Because again, everything is all one. And therefore, you can't simply argue that, one is even better than another. People will choose certain devotions to follow for certain very specific purposes, based on who they are, what sort of position they represent in society, what they believe they need, or what they believe they need to sort of promise to a god or goddess. But there's no sense of sort of a hierarchy. All right, let me give you a little bit on sort of Hindu practice. And this is going to be very important also when we come to talk about the role of Hinduism in sort of national culture, and especially when we talk about Gandhi, and the way in which Hinduism and politics begin to get embedded in the late 19th and early 20th century in South Asia. We'll need to discuss that. We'll need to sort of come back to this a little bit. Let me give you some terms here. The big thing that I didn't put up here, I meant to put this as sort of an overarching thing, but let's put it right here. the big key is a concept called darshan. If you have a phone out, please put it away. What's darshan? Anyone know darshan?
Sacred presence.
It's sort of a sacred presence, but even more sort of at a basic level, it means sort of seeing and being seen, to be visible. The Indian national television network is Doordarshan. Again, sort of, something to be seen. Darshan is the notion of being in the presence of the divine, marking the presence of the divine in the world, acknowledging that everyone and all things are, you might say, sort of singular in their origin. They all come from one thing. That's the big thing we have to understand. Darshan is that. And the concept of darshan is very much sort of rules devotional practices. A couple of which I just want to highlight briefly. And again, there are multiple kinds of practices, thousands, hundreds of thousands of different types of devotions. And a lot of it's done in sort of a household setting. Whether our temples, whether our pilgrimage sites and festival sites, a lot of this is also very personal. The most personal is what might be called puja, which is domestic devotion or domestic practice. Puja is quite simply acknowledging the divine in the world. Puja is not necessarily designed to be devotion to a particular god, although it can be. But puja is sort of the most elemental part of devotion. It simply means acknowledging that you are part of the wider world, that you are part of and linked into a larger creation. That is, puja oftentimes focuses on or centers on something that involves your senses. It's not just sort of an internal meditation. But puja involves, at times, touch, vision, tasting, hearing. That is, people can practice puja by sharing a specific food, by, in the morning, providing each other with a simple marking on their foreheads, by going and bathing or going and immersing themselves in a particular river, drinking from a particular river. So you have this sense, and what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to remind you of the rest of the world. That you're not an isolated being, but rather you are linked to all creation because everything comes out of this one. It can be as simple as using incense, smelling something. Again, to awaken your senses and direct you outward. Now, some particular types of puja take place in very specific places. That's the other thing to understand, is that again, there is this notion that the entire world is a divine creation. But in some specific geographical places, and this will link into some of the things we talked about last week, in some specific geographical locations, the presence of the divine is really strong. And that to do something there, to practice puja there, to make a pilgrimage there, is a good thing. A sort of, unqualified good thing to do. These places are known as tirthas. 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 And I got a brief map here of a couple of. These are ones, again, largely tracing along the Ganges River, the most important of which is the city called Varanasi. Which is, again, seen as a place where not only is there this sort of divine energy But the Ganges, and in particular this spot in the Ganges, is seen as particularly holy. It's seen as a sort of a threshold. It's the scene of important sacrifices all the way back into the Vedic culture. It's seen, again, Tirtha literally means crossing point or crossing place. It's a boundary. And this is not limited to practices in South Asia. Lots of cultures, the sort of pre-Christian religions of Western and Northern Europe are going to be full of these. The notion that particular springs and rivers, mountain peaks and others are sort of closer to the gods, closer to the supernatural than other. And that there are certain places through which, you might say, divine entities move back and forth between one world and the next. So there are particular places, particular locations, where if you make a pilgrimage to it, if you bathe there, if you reside there for a little bit, you accumulate significant virtue, significant credit. The most famous of these is Varanasi. This is a picture just taken. These are called the Ghats. Remember I talked last time, Ghats meaning steps in terms of the mountains on the eastern and western sides of the Deccan Plateau. These Ghats in Varanasi are where people will come for pilgrimages. If you die in Varanasi and can be cremated in Varanasi with your ashes placed into the river, Ganges there, you are in essence released from this cycle of life into the next world. Again, there are sort of, favors that come for you for having made that particular sacrifice. So you have these Ghats, some of which are quite literally called the burning Ghats, where you have cremations going on all day, and where there are people whose sole purpose in life is the organization and sort of, functioning of these funeral pyres. Lots of people will go out in boats. Lots of people will make offerings there. People will do it in the day. People will do it in the evening with candles, oftentimes floating them in leaves, small sort of constructed vessels, even sort of paper things designed to let the candle even float just for a few moments. Again, it's seen as one of these significant crossing places where you acknowledge the divine and you ask for divine favor. Any questions about this? I realize we're covering a lot here today, and so please do ask. Yes?
So is that meant to counteract bad karma?
Well, it's not necessarily bad karma. It's it gives you favor. Yes. One of the things we'll talk about the idea of karma. In some senses, there's no such thing as sort of bad or good karma. Karma is the record of what you do. And basically, the big thing that I think sometimes gets missed is that dharma basically is what you should do. Karma is the record of what you do. The idea being, well, if you do what you ought to do, it's not necessarily a sense of that's sort of good karma or bad karma. It's simply a record of what you did. If you do what you ought to do, you will be rewarded by sort of moving upward in the cycle of reincarnation or rebirth. If you don't do what you're supposed to do, you'll be moving downward. But it's not something that happens in your life. That is, it's not the sort of thing, if you don't do what you're supposed to do, you're going to get nailed in this life. The idea of there's sort of, karma is going to come to get you or something like that. Karma may come to get you, but at that point you may be down, much lower in the cycle of rebirth, and you're not going to be sort of conscious that karma has got you. So I think I tend to stay away from the ideas of sort of bad and good karma. Karma is simply your record. It's like your permanent record, which we all supposedly have somewhere. But in principle, Skinner's office, not that. But you have this record of what you do, and the question is, how does what you do accord with what you ought to have been doing? Now, for most people, dharma, going and making this pilgrimage, that's something you should do, regardless of your station, regardless of your location, whether geographically or socially or culturally in South Asia, if you are a Hindu. But at the same time, it's not something that's going to keep you in a certain position or, hinder you in attaining ultimate sort of release from this life. But puja, the practice of duty, are linked into, let me go back for a sec here to these words, are linked into the sort of larger, as you can see here, karma is action or conduct, dharma is right action or duty. And ideally, you want your karma to line up with your dharma. And again, this is about not simply about devotional practice, but the larger idea at work here is that human beings, or really all creation, are enmeshed in this cycle of birth and rebirth, or life and rebirth. And what you have is something called samsara. It's sort of, you can see how, for example, ideas in Buddhism emerge out of early Hindu practices. But it's an idea of sort of what you do. And if you do your dharma, if your actions align with your duty, then you will continue to pass through this cycle of rebirth. Higher and higher, you'll be sort of rewarded. You'll go higher and higher in sort of the hierarchy of being. And then ultimately, you will be released. You will be liberated. Something equivalent to sort of the notion of nirvana is moksha, release. And in essence, you go and you join the divine, Brahman. Yes?
So who decides and how do you know?
Oh, how do you know? Well, that's a sort of a, who decides is, in some ways, who you listen to. That is about what dharma is.
So what's my duty? Who decides what my duty is?
Well, it depends. Some people might say, well, here is what you were born into. This is, again, and this goes back to the whole, we haven't even talked about ideas about sort of caste, jati, and sort of, being born into certain things. And you do what you're supposed to do. That, doesn't mean as much today as it did perhaps 2,000 years ago or 1,000 years ago. But the idea is that there is something you ought to do. If you do it, you will be rewarded. Now, you're not going to know that you're rewarded. Because the thing that's moving on is that tiny little piece of that thing called Atman, or sometimes called Atman Brahman, that sort of tiny little divine spirit of you. That's going to move to something else and sort of rest in a sort of more rewarded state until ultimately it is released. The body is just this sort of vessel. You're not carrying with you the consciousness of previous things that you've done. Yes.
Does moksha always entail death, or can you?
Well, it's both death, but it's also sort of life in death.
Death of the vessel.
Yeah, death of the vessel. You are freed from all of these earthly bonds, all of these materialistic bonds, and released into the divine.
Freed into what?
Well, no one's ever come back to report, but it's supposed to be pretty nice. But in essence, this is the thing. It gets fairly vague. There's the old joke about about the Buddhist at the deli, make me one with everything. That's sort of what it is. You guys have all heard that, right? But that's sort of what it is. You become part of Brahman. You become sort of part of this spirit that is of which you had previously only been sort of an emanation or a product of before.
So what's their view on babies? Do they?
Yeah. Well, that's a difficult one. It depends who you talk to, because some people will say, well, in essence, it's just a do-over. Other people will say, well, where is that? Where was, if you have a child who dies, where was that child cremated? People will make extensive efforts to bring their children to be cremated in places like Varanasi because that's seen as perhaps helping them. but it's understood. I mean, this is the thing, is that a lot of it is simply phrasing the ideas of this is, what is what is. That that you are in a specific position, and if the particular vessel, the particular body, whatever it is that you're in, whatever happens to that, you'll get sort of, how should I put it? You can get sort of not a do-over, but you get kind of you get a rebirth at sort of a similar level. Now, I mean, there's also this notion again that, you go, I mean, part of it, a lot of this has to do with the fact that we're not only talking, let me just stress this here, we're not only talking about sort of theology here. One of the things about religious and cultural practices is that they're about ordering social and community boundaries and hierarchies. That is that a lot of these ideas, a lot of these things that are sort of preached, tend to come from people who are at the top of the social hierarchy. That is one thing that this notion of rebirth and sort of progression towards some sort of final release or some sort of final end of your earthly constraints. I mean, in some places, it's understood as being sort of promising salvation no matter who you are or where you are. There is a way to get to salvation. But it's also a way of saying to people, you are where you are for a reason. That is that, saying that, I mean, this applies across societies, across cultures. In the 17th century, kings in Europe saying, well, I'm king. Why? Because God wants me to be king. God wants you to be a peasant. God wants me to be king. Who are we to argue with God? What you have in these texts is, and this is something like the laws of Manu in particular, you have an elaboration that increases in sort of complexity over time and intensity over time as well, an elaboration of a social system, a hierarchy, which, at times you can't justify itself simply on the notion of, well, I have more because of luck. No, I have more because of my, willingness to do whatever it takes. No, it's I have more because I am more godly. I occupy this position because of my sort of relative superiority to you. And of course, it tends to be written and passed down by the people at the top. Very few people write up a thing saying, there is a divine hierarchy in the world, and I am at the bottom. Everyone else is better than me and should remain so. Very hard to find that in the world. You can perhaps find it some places, but it's very hard to find. So this whole notion of there being a cycle of life and rebirth, of there being a reward for right action, is in some ways a way of ensuring that people don't question where they are in a society. It's a way of assuring that you have sort of how should I put it? An acceptance of hierarchy, an acceptance of sort of multiple levels in society. So it's not only a theological thing, you might say, it's also very much a sort of a socio-cultural thing. Is everyone with me on this? So you have, again, you've got these ideas, these larger ideas. Everyone is sort of, one. Everyone emerges from one entity, or everyone is sort of, the product of one thing. But very soon, the human element takes over. If I were sort of a historian or sociologist of religion, I'd say this is what human beings do. You have religious ideas which will say, we are all one, we are all, sort of sharing in this divine creation. We are all products of the divine. However, I am a slightly better product of the divine than you are. That's sort of the normal human impulse. If you look at the history of the early Christian church, you have sort of a little while as this sort of sect awaiting the apocalypse in the Middle East and arguing for this sort of radical egalitarianism. When the apocalypse doesn't come, and it looks like it's going to be around for a while, you start borrowing Roman institutions and start instituting hierarchies. Next thing you know, you have a bishop, which would have puzzled greatly some of the earliest sort of Christian proselytizers. There would be a hierarchy. Similar things here. And what you have is this idea of action, this idea of right action, this idea of sort of relationships between peoples. And that gets, in some ways, sort of inserted into religious practice. That is, the notion that this sort of idea of there being a social hierarchy is there from early on in this Vedic civilization. But what happens is that the notion that there is a specific hierarchy and that hierarchy is linked to, in essence, your own practices, that hierarchy is linked to where you stand in relationship to the divine, or how close you stand to sort of salvation, that emerges over time. Is everybody with me here so far? Again, people have made their life's work trying to interpret this for people, and so it's you have the emergence of something called caste. Now, caste is a word that's used in a very sort of general sense, but it's also something that works in very specific ways. Today, in the Republic of India, caste is forbidden as a means of differentiating between people in terms of negative ways. But the impact of caste is such that in the Republic of India to this day, people who have come out of or are the descendants of people who are in certain castes that were traditionally kept low on the caste hierarchy or even out of it in particular, they can claim certain things, claim certain preferential treatment in things like college admissions, in politics, in sort of applications for government jobs, things like that.
So it's kind of affirmative action.
There is. I mean, there are people who've written on the difference between this and sort of what you might call affirmative action in this country, and they've argued. I mean, it is much more complicated in the Republic of India than it is here, but it also reflects the pervasiveness of caste discrimination, which is very real in South Asia and remains an issue in South Asia, the more that people will say it's not an issue is usually a reminder of the fact that it remains an issue. The idea of caste is sort of generally credited, again, to this Vedic society, which seems to have been initially a three-tiered society, resembling the type that would emerge in, for example, in medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, there was oftentimes understood to be three categories in society: those who worked, those who prayed, and those who fought. That is, those who worked was the great mass of the people on the land. Those who prayed, obviously the clergy, and then those who fought, translated roughly as those, or meaning roughly those who ruled. And you see that beginning to be created in the Vedas with this idea of sort of the laws of Manu, the idea that society is in some senses personified, and that various groups represent various, the hands, the legs, the head, the body of society. This notion of caste gets a sort of a particular designation. It becomes known as Varna in the Rig Veda. Varna literally means color. And it points to the fact that one of the things that happens in this period of roughly sort of 2000 to 1000 BCE is that as these Indo-Europeans move into South Asia, they will encounter people who are, you might say, indigenous to their region. People who oftentimes have darker skin. And people who will be captured in war, people who will be literally enslaved. And in some ways, that enslavement, that subordination, will get justification in a sort of religious sense by arguing that there is sort of an order in society. And the big clue being, again, and some people say, well, no, Varna means color in terms of there are different colors associated with different castes. But many historians of Hinduism point to this and say, look, skin color seems to have been this early division. And that there is this gradual sort of movement of either enslavement or forced migration of those indigenous people who were there in South Asia southward. It's largely the people whose languages, as I mentioned last time, are part of that Dravidian language family found in the southern part of India. It's out of the Vedas, out of these various sort of practices, there emerges what you might call sort of an idealized vision of caste, or an idealized vision of Varna, which is designed to, sort of provide an overall scheme or an overall sort of format for society. And this is the way in which it works. And you'll see that they will have sort of colors associated with them in terms of threads or things that people will wear either on their necks or on their wrists. What you have, in essence, is a differentiation made with, this one doesn't have, for example, the top. This simply has the sort of the lower three in this division, and then what comes to be known as the Dalits or untouchables. But basically, you have, I'll go back, you can see the little letters, the words bigger here. What you have is this notion that at the top there is a priestly class, Brahmins. You'll then have, underneath them, Kshatriyas, understood to be warriors, but in reality, apart from Brahmins, a lot of these will become very expansive categories. That is, Gandhi technically is someone who was born into the second caste, Kshatriya, but he was what was known as a Khatri from Gujarat, which largely meant someone who took an administrative role for a king or a prince or a state. So as it becomes, Kshatriya goes from being sort of simply warriors and defenders to actually being, in some ways, state employees. Yeah.
Did the Brahmins ever cross over into the Kshatriyas? The Christians, I mean, the Pope was a lot of popes were really, they were knights. They went out and led their army.
Mm-hmm. No, you can't. Well. You can't go up to. You can't really go up to a Brahmin. That is, unless there are people who will.
Down, that's my point.
Would the Brahmins be warriors?
Yeah, would they be warriors?
Well, it depends. Probably not. No, Brahmins would not be warriors. In fact, I mean, Brahmins are very unlikely to even be kings. That is, they're not necessarily likely to be rulers. They're understood to be sort of the most educated, the most religious, also the purest. Because all sorts of things, as you create this, all sorts of taboos, all sorts of restrictions, all sorts of ideas of pollution, to use a technical term, will come to dominate these relationships. What you will have, in particular, between Shudras and Kshatriyas, these three here, Shudra being sort of a laborer, a Vaishya being trader, landlord, artisan, down to Shudra, meaning, in essence, sort of laborer or cultivator. At least initially, this whole idea doesn't even exist. But Dalit, which is a word, one of several words, applied to people who are sometimes called outcasts, people who actually are not even on the caste ladder and have no hope of going up the caste ladder. What you do have in, fairly recent times, the last 300 years or so, thanks to the advent of enormous bureaucracies, whether in Mughal India, colonial British South Asia, and then the modern Republic of India, you've had people who have been furiously defining themselves up and down this caste ladder because of certain things that were sort of identified with it. That is, that lots of people sort of identified themselves as higher level castes because there would be certain benefits that accrued to them in the 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. However, since 1947, with the idea that there are certain castes who get preferential treatment now because they've traditionally been so subordinated and so persecuted in South Asia, you have people who've tried to sort of go back down now. That is, if you show up and you ask someone who they are, a lot of times people are going to do a calculation. There's nothing there. There's nothing. You don't have, like, a third ear if you're a Kshatriya or something like that. Maybe you do, but no one's ever showed me. But you have this notion that, this is not set in stone. People will define themselves up and down. Now, Brahmins are never going to seek to define themselves in any other way, and very few people are going to claim to be Brahmins, because Brahmins hold that line very strictly. But you have these others. In actual practice, fairly soon, you don't simply have this notion of sort of, a 3 or 4 tiered system. You have what's known as jati, which are thousands of what some people call subcastes, which can be local, can be regional, can be based in family, can be based in occupation. It is something that continues to this day, and continues even if you go sort of delineations within Shudras, people will even argue that there are delineations within people who are not quite yet considered in the caste system. And again, that's how you get from sort of Gandhi being born into a family that's a Khatri, Gujarati Khatri family, which means basically a Gujarati bureaucratic, but high-level bureaucratic family. Not someone who's sort of a low-level clerk, but someone who's sort of more of an advisor to a prince. These don't have, obviously, a lot of relevance to some people in South Asia today, but it does have relevance in particularly rural and agricultural parts of South Asia, where there remains a lot of tension and a lot of insistence on caste boundaries, because caste boundaries provide sort of a template for, or provide a framework for relationships, particularly between people who own the land and people who work on the land. And there will be, at times it gets sort of very hard to sort of see it, but there will be, in essence, sort of almost sort of an economic conflict, but one whose language is very much rooted in caste, or the notion of, people are acting above themselves. People are demanding too much. I mean, one of the reasons why both Christianity and Islam, as well, until we'll talk about Buddhism maybe today, maybe we'll start at the next time, are so appealing to people in South Asia after, about 500 BCE, in the case of Buddhism, is it offers a way out of these categories. Now, of course, there are some scholars, especially of South Asian Islam, who will point out that by the time you get to the Middle Ages, you're starting to see sort of caste divisions emerging within the South Asian Muslim community as well. People based on sort of on what they do, and in particular, you get the notion of pollution and the notion of separation. That is, that there are sort of that there is sort of a hierarchy, not only of sort of relationship to salvation, of sort of worth within a society, but that these boundaries have to be maintained. And again, it is in some ways not just sort of based perhaps in theology, it's also based very much in the idea of preserving a social order. That is, there are regulations on who can dine with who can marry whom. And again, this isn't simply sort of, a Brahmin can't marry anyone else. but someone from another Brahmin family. But even down here, with the notion that people in certain regions belonging to certain jati could only marry people either perhaps from that region, within that jati group, perhaps there may be this idea that you can marry outside with that region, but again, only within a particular jati group. And again, this is not something necessarily that you see as sort of formal policy, but it's something that's still very much followed. And again, as discrimination in caste is legally banned, you still see lots of people in India using words for caste, words for social status. One thing that people still look to is that there is still this tradition of parents trying to find partners for their children. It's online now too. It used to be simply sort of pages of newspapers and so of people, matrimonials they were called. People sort of looking for partners, looking for partners for their children. And they would use all sorts of codes. One was skin color, was a way of talking about caste. But they had to come up with all these sorts of ideas. You couldn't, sometimes you couldn't simply say light skin. The best one that people, this was very popular in the Punjab, was to describe someone's, I think because of the agriculture in the Punjab, but they described someone as having a wheaten complexion. And you could sit there and go, what is wheaten complexion? But again, it's these sort of code words that are used. So you have these notions which pass down, and which, what you see is people taking these ideas of duty, these broader ideas of duty, and using them in many ways to structure a society. You have the coming together, and this happens in all religious practices. That is, the coming together of sort of theological and philosophical ideas and their interaction with, and ultimately their sort of entanglement with, very human socioeconomic hierarchies. With, at times, religion being used more as a way of justifying hierarchy than as religion being used to sort of set up a hierarchy in the first place. You tend to get the hierarchy, then you tend to get the justification for it. I think what happens in South Asia is perhaps no accident. Let me just take, I've got 2 minutes here, I've got 5 minutes on there, I'm not quite sure. Let's see, we'll settle it there. I've got 6 minutes on my phone, so we'll put it somewhere in the middle. If my phone is synced to my computer, why do they reflect 2 different times? I don't know. But again, sages far wiser than I have considered this. One of the things we have to understand is that there is a reaction. The fact that this Hindu belief system emerges, or the system called Hinduism emerges, takes multiple variation, has lots of complexity, but that it is at times very much used to prop up and justify a power structure. This does lead to reactions against it. It will lead, in the so-called Common Era, to people moving to embrace either Christianity or to embrace Islam. But even before you get to the Common Era, around 500 or so, 600 to 500 BCE, you see a movement towards what we now know as Buddhism. It's perhaps, let me see, what's this? And again, we're going to move into talk. We're going to talk about Buddhism now. And Buddhism is not, as you can see here, one of the major faiths practiced in South Asia. Although, again, any faith practiced in South Asia is going to have, simply by definition of where it is, by virtue of where it is, going to have millions of followers or millions of adherents. But Buddhism is largely sort of, again, here on the fringes where sort of the South Asian China borderland is, and then down here in Sri Lanka. At times, 2 different types of Buddhism. Sri Lankan Buddhism can at times look very different from Buddhism from parts of Tibet, Bhutan, Nepal, and even parts of Far Eastern Bengal. Buddhism, just briefly, is in many ways a reaction to the power structures or the use of Hinduism to reinforce power. That is, in particular, Buddhism is a reaction against caste. Now, of course, its proponent, it's the person who is sort of understood as the initiator. I don't want to say the creator of Buddhism, but the person who is the sort of how should I put it? The earliest practitioner of Buddhism is himself a noble, Prince Siddhartha Gautama. Dates are sort of roughly 563 to 483. Someone who is very much disgusted with what he sees as the corruption the caste is bringing to religious practice. The notion that a caste and the sort of worship of too many deities is distracting people from the main message of the notion of this underlying unity in creation. So you have, and I'm just going to mention this briefly, Buddhism emerging, it's not the only, but it's perhaps the most well-known, at least in this period, or that we know from this period, the most well-known sort of renunciation of the caste structure. It keeps this notion of a sort of cyclical movement of life and rebirth. It keeps this notion of a unity. It is very much more attuned to the notion, though, that not only is there sort of this, everything emerges from one substance, from one creator, you might say, but it also argues much more stringently and much more sort of openly than Hinduism does. It argues that in essence, everything out here in creation is simply a vision, an apparition. That to hold yourself or to bind yourself to material things, to even things like affection and emotion, is in some ways to bind yourself to an illusion. So it takes a much sort of stricter approach by arguing that in essence, since everything sort of emanates from one, everything is in essence sort of a show. Everything is, you think you're seeing stuff. You think you're existing in something, but you're not. That therefore you ought to practice real renunciation. Renouncing as much of the world as you can. Physically, materially, emotionally, as a way of sort of properly understanding your place within it. I'll say a couple more things about Buddhism. I want to say a couple of things about Jainism as well, and we will then move on next time to talking about the early Indus civilization and start to move towards the period that we've been talking about today, not just in terms of religious history, but in terms of political and geographic and even you might sort of say social history as well. All right, I will see you all on Thursday. Does everyone have a copy of the reading? If you don't, come pick up. I've only got one copy left here. 1, 2, 3. Okay, you know what? I'm going to make copies and bring it next time. Or I'm going to scan it. Go to the Blackboard website. If you haven't got the syllabus, you can print it off from the Blackboard website. It's on there. If you're desperately in need of a syllabus, I do have a few of these syllabi left. If you would like a syllabus, a physical copy, come get it now as quickly as you can. Thank you.